We're going to continue our discussion about the Constitution. On this slide, you see the idea of separation of powers, and we talked about this in class yesterday. We see the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, and it also gives the idea of what each branch does. So we know that the legislative branch makes the law, legislative and law. The executive branch enforces the law, so we have executive enforces, and the judicial branch interprets the law, so judicial interprets. So legislative makes law, executive enforces, and judicial interprets. And while the framers recognized that we needed a strong central government in order to respond effectively and efficiently to problems such as Shays' Rebellion, they're also going to take steps to ensure that not one person or one group in government gains too much power. So, taking a page from this French Enlightenment philosopher, Montesquieu, that we've already talked about, they're going to incorporate the idea of separation of powers into the Constitution. And as the framers devised the government functions as three distinct entities with very specific powers. And we talked about it yesterday. When we talk about separation of powers, we usually line it up into three different columns so you can see the powers that each branch has and how they're not the same as the other branches. The legislative branch creates legislation, laws. The executive branch, created by Article 2 of the Constitution, has the authority to carry out the laws as enacted by Congress, and also places the armed forces under civilian command. So the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the judicial branch, which is created by Article 3, we know interprets the law primarily through the power of judicial review. And in the next section that we're going to talk about, the early republic, we're going to look at a court case from 1803 called Marbury versus Madison, and we'll look at how that power of judicial review was initially given to the Supreme Court. Let's look specifically at each branch. Let's look first at the executive branch. This is headed by the office of the president. So to ensure that the nation's laws get effectively carried out, the framers of the Constitution created a strong executive branch. This is, again, headed by the office of the President of the United States. Currently, your president is Barack Obama. He will be leaving office January 20th, and Donald Trump will be sworn in as your next president. Article 2 of the Constitution spells out the president's powers and its duties, and let's look at those. To execute or to carry out the law as established by Congress. He has the right to send bills that he or she, if we ever get there, disagrees with back to Congress, also known as a veto power. Congress can override a presidential veto, and you looked at this yesterday in the activity that you did, but such a measure takes a supermajority, or two-thirds of both houses to pass. And when you're talking about two-thirds of 535 people, you're talking about a lot of people having to agree on a controversial topic or bill. It's not likely to happen, and that's why the framers wrote the Constitution this way. Also, the right to appoint the judiciary, and with the Senate's advice and consent. So the president has the right to appoint them, but the Senate has to approve them. The power as a civilian of commander-in-chief over all of the American armed forces. And by the mid-20th century, the president gains the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. The executive branch also has the authority to develop the nation's foreign policy. Again, with the advice and consent of the Senate, so it has to be approved by the Senate, and the obligation to provide a yearly address to Congress. Now, on January 20th, Donald Trump will be giving his State of the Union address. He'll be sworn in, and somewhere shortly after that, he'll be giving his State of the Union address. For many years, presidents treated the State of the Union address as a mere formality. But in the 20th and the 21st century, presidents have found it to be a huge national forum for announcing new legislative programs, things they want to get passed. In other words, an agenda for the legislative branch to look at during their next session. Article 2 also spells out the basic requirements for anyone seeking the office of president. Candidates must be at least 35 years old, be a natural-born U.S. citizen, and must have resided in the United States for at least 14 years prior to their election. Let's revisit one thing there. Natural-born U.S. citizen. If you were born anywhere other than the United States, you can never hold the office of president, according to the Constitution. the judicial branch. And while the framers devised the Constitution to provide a strong legislative branch and a strong executive branch based on the detail it offers, the judicial branch seems like almost an afterthought. Article 3, and we know that this is the shortest of the three first articles, describes the judiciary, and it simply institutes a Supreme Court to be headed by a Chief Justice and inferior courts, and it leaves it very vague as to what those inferior courts should look like. And it says that Congress has the ability to create these inferior courts as it sees fit. So as the nation grows, legislation is going to shape the judicial branch, first beginning with the Judiciary Act of 1789, and again, we'll look at that in our next project. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is going to set the number of associate judges added to the Supreme Court at 5, and also is going to establish a federal court system throughout the 13 states. However, the Supreme Court case that I've already referenced, Marbury v. Madison in 1803, is going to provide the most significant power to the judicial branch by defining the court's power of judicial review. And this is the ability of the court to look at any law placed on the books and to declare that law unconstitutional, just by their interpretation of what the law means and what they think the Constitution says. And if they feel like it's in contradiction to the Constitution, the Supreme Court gets to wipe it away from the books, and the legislative branch has to start over. Chief Justice John Marshall, who's pictured here, is a strong Federalist, and he's also going to enhance the court's power in several cases that affirm the supremacy of the federal government over the state governments. Let's look at a few discussion questions, and we're going to answer these in class, so it'll be beneficial for you to go ahead and write these down. You might see some of these on, say, a quiz in class. On whose theories did the framers base the Constitution's separation of powers, and what duties does each branch perform? What powers and responsibilities does the Constitution give the executive branch? What structure does the Constitution describe for the judicial branch? What power does the judicial branch have over Congress? Now let's look specifically at division of power. And this is where we're getting into my little acronym that I gave you, FLIPPER, CS, these 7 principles laid out by the Constitution. Okay. Another issue the framers want to deal with is giving the national government enough power to carry out its duties, but also leaving the states a measure of sovereignty as well. And that sovereignty is where they get to act as their own state, as their own person. And the solution to this is what we call today federalism. In the federal system, certain powers are granted to the national government, and these are what we call delegated powers. If you see down here, these include the power to declare war, establish a postal service, a system of weights and measures, as well as maintaining an army and a navy. And other powers are reserved, and these are reserved to the states. And an example includes education, marriage, and divorce laws, and speed limits. However, federal laws and court rulings, such as those declaring public school segregation unconstitutional, have blurred the lines between federal and state authority. A lot of times when states can't decide on something, or when residents of states argue and they push that decision to the Supreme Court, they in turn take power away from the states and give it to the federal government by their inability to resolve and make decisions on the state level. And when those decisions can't be made and we can't come to a decision on the state level, the federal government has to step in and make those decisions. And a lot of those powers that have traditionally been reserved for the states have been gradually given back to the federal government as a result of our inability to make those decisions on the state level. Concurrent powers. Still other powers are called concurrent. They belong to both the federal and to the state governments. This includes the power to tax and the use of eminent domain. And this comes from the Fifth Amendment, one of the Bill of Rights, that says that we have the power, that governments have the power of eminent domain. And this means they can take private property for the public good, but they have to pay you for it, and they have to justly compensate you for it. implied powers. And this is one of the reasons why it's my personal opinion that the legislative branch has a lot of power. While the framers listed a series of powers delegated to the national government, some are going to have concern about circumstances for which no specific constitutional clause exists that might require government action. So, if the Constitution didn't specifically address a topic, what would we do when that came up? So, our solution, the framer's solution, is going to be Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution, also called the Necessary and Proper Clause, or the Elastic Clause. Because at times throughout history, the legislative branch is going to stretch it like an elastic rubber band and then let it go back and contract and stretch it and use it to expand their powers as they see fit. The text of this clause states that Congress shall have the power to make laws, all laws, which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. In other words, the federal government can enact any law and make policies in instances where there's not a specific constitutional provision, as long as a law or policy doesn't allows the government to carry out a delegated power. For example, the Constitution doesn't mention regulating airline travel or radio or television signals, but the Constitution does give the federal government the power to regulate trade, as well as provide a common defense and secure the general welfare. So the Elastic Clause allows for these types of laws to be enacted. And we drew this on the board yesterday. The checks and balances. So federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances. Along with this doctrine of separation of powers, the framers are going to take further measures against any one branch having too much control over the federal government. And to do this, they create a system known as checks and balances. So each branch has certain checks or controls it places over the other two branches. And for example, the legislative branch makes a law. However, before a bill becomes law, the president must sign it. So alternatively, the president can veto a bill, which means he puts a big X on it, and send it back to Congress, but Congress can secure a 2/3 majority in both houses and can override the president's veto, and the bill can become law anyway without the president's signature. So the legislative branch also acts as a grand jury and a trial jury in cases of impeachment. So if we impeach the president, the House gets to bring the charges against him, and the Senate gets to hold the trial. The judicial branch has the power of judicial review. And that is, it can declare any acts of Congress or state legislatures unconstitutional. However, the Supreme Court may need to rely on the other branches to actually enforce its ruling. We're going to talk about Andrew Jackson in the coming months, and a court case is handed to Andrew Jackson to which they tell him, here's what we've decided, here's what you must do, and Andrew Jackson tells the Supreme Court, you made the decision, you go enforce it. In other words, he doesn't agree with it, and so he, as the executive, is supposed to enforce the law, but doesn't do so. And so we'll look at what happens when those branches of government don't really work the way they're supposed to. So the president has the power to appoint new judges to vacancies in the judicial branch, and the legislative branch must also approve these appointments. And if you look, anytime you see this, it's talking about the idea of checks and balances. So for every power that the executive has, these two have a check on his power. For every power that the judicial branch has, these two have a check on their power. And so ideally, every branch of government has the exact same amount of power, and neither one can override and can be more powerful than the other. Again, that's in theory. So let's look at some more discussion questions, and I'm going to leave you here today. How does federalism deal with the issue of government authority versus state sovereignty? How does the Constitution allow for the addition of implied powers, and what are some examples of implied powers? What purpose does a system of checks and balances serve, and give an example of how it works? Make sure you have those questions written down. They'll benefit you in class tomorrow. Have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.